Something fundamental has shifted in the Black Sea, and most people aren't being told what it really means. While everyone focuses on battlefield maps in eastern Ukraine, with attention on artillery duels, trenches, and incremental territorial changes, there is a much bigger transformation happening along the coast. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it's far more consequential. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor is not just a humanitarian fix or a technical workaround for shipping. It is a clear strategic signal with far-reaching consequences that go beyond Ukraine's borders. Odessa used to be seen as untouchable, a port city protected by geography, international law, and Western political guarantees. But that assumption is now obsolete. The corridor connected to Odessa, once narrow and carefully managed, is now a contested area under constant pressure. The situation has changed, and Europe's most vital trade routes no longer operate under conditions of certainty, but under a fragile tolerance. This tolerance can be withdrawn at any time. This is not just a story about one port. It's not even primarily about Ukraine. What we are witnessing is the gradual reconfiguration of maritime control in the northern Black Sea, a crucial region that links Eurasian production zones with European consumption markets. Grain, energy inputs, fertilizers, metals, entire supply chains depend on unhindered access through this maritime space. When access is conditional, the effects ripple outward, impacting the Danube Basin, the Balkans, southern Europe, and, ultimately, the industrial core of the European Union. For decades, Odessa symbolized stability. Even during times of political instability or regional tensions, commerce flowed, ships docked, contracts were honored, and markets adjusted without collapsing. This historical pattern led to the dangerous illusion that trade infrastructure exists outside of geopolitical competition. But today, that illusion is being dismantled. Piece by piece, the reality of this changing balance of power is being revealed. It's not about warships blockading sea lanes or dramatic confrontations. It's something far more sophisticated: pressure without declaration. Missile reach, drone surveillance, electronic monitoring, insurance risk, and uncertainty are being layered together, shifting behavior quietly and effectively. Ships still sail, but fewer of them. Cargo still moves, but at higher costs and greater risks. Odessa's port remains operational, but its reliability, the core of its power, is steadily eroding. This is where the balance of power is shifting, not through explosions or territorial conquest, but through leverage. Leverage over markets, leverage over governments, and leverage over decision makers who suddenly find that economic stability depends on conditions they do not control. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor, therefore, is not a sign of resilience, but a sign of strain. It signals that the old rules are no longer valid, and that what was once neutral maritime space is now, in effect, a battleground. To understand why this moment is so critical, we need to take a step back and consider how Odessa became strategically indispensable, why its security was taken for granted, and how that assumption is now being slowly but systematically dismantled. The consequences of this shift are not something Europe is fully prepared for. Odessa has never been just another port city. Its purpose was strategic from the moment it was founded in the late 18th century. Designed as a southern maritime gateway, Odessa quickly became the primary outlet through which the agricultural and industrial wealth of the interior flowed. Grain from the fertile plains, coal and metals from deeper inland regions, all converged on Odessa before reaching European and global markets. Over time, Odessa's role was not just commercial but highly strategic. It became a key node, connecting political power with economic mobility. Control over Odessa meant access, influence, and leverage. This importance didn't vanish with regime changes or shifting borders. It persisted through wars, revolutions, and eventually the Soviet era, where Odessa played a crucial role as one of the most important maritime outlets of the Soviet Union, supporting both civilian markets and industrial supply chains. When the Soviet system collapsed, many assumed that Odessa's strategic importance might decrease. However, the opposite occurred. Independent Ukraine inherited one of Eastern Europe's most valuable port infrastructures, and Odessa quickly became central to the country's survival. By the early 2000s, Odessa was handling millions of tons of cargo annually, moving goods such as grain, sunflower oil, fertilizers, steel, and industrial products. These shipments not only fed markets across the European Union, the Middle East, and Africa, but they were also vital to Ukraine's economic survival. The port was not just profitable, it was indispensable. Then, in 2014, everything changed. The annexation of Crimea by Russia had a profound impact on Ukraine's maritime strategy. Sevastopol, Ukraine's primary naval base and maritime anchor, was lost in an instant. Odessa, once simply a vital economic asset, became a strategic necessity. Without Odessa, Ukraine's access to the sea and its ability to function as a trading nation was severely constrained. This new reality didn't go unnoticed by the West. NATO's interest in the Black Sea region grew, with more frequent naval visits, expanded intelligence sharing, and increased surveillance coverage. These moves were officially framed as deterrence and reassurance, but in reality, they reflected a growing recognition that Odessa had become a geopolitical fault line. By 2022, when large-scale war broke out, Odessa was no longer simply seen as infrastructure. It had become a symbol, a crucial node whose survival was now seen as essential to Ukraine's economic and political viability. But no matter how symbolic it was, Odessa's security could no longer be taken for granted. Geography may remain unchanged, but control over geography is always subject to change. Over the past year, the operational environment around Odessa has been steadily transformed by a series of incremental actions: missile strikes, drone pressure, naval maneuvering, electronic surveillance, and economic coercion. What was once perceived as stable now looks conditional. What once flowed freely now moves under constant threat. This shift from a safe, open passage to contested access is not just a temporary disruption, it is a critical turning point. It sets the stage for understanding why the expansion of the Odessa Corridor matters. What exactly has changed, and why does it matter now? Originally, the Odessa Corridor was framed as a pragmatic solution, a narrow maritime route designed to allow export traffic to continue despite the broader war. This new corridor was presented as a commercial workaround, aimed at ensuring exports despite ongoing hostilities. Its viability relied on key assumptions: restrained escalation, predictable behavior, and the belief that external guarantees would be enough to maintain the route's functionality. But those assumptions have been proven wrong. Over the past few months, Russia has steadily increased its operational reach across the northwestern Black Sea, and this expansion hasn't come in the form of a traditional naval blockade, with visible surface combatants sealing off sea lanes. Instead, Russia has employed a more subtle approach, a layered campaign of persistent pressure. Rather than provoking immediate confrontation, this strategy is designed to reshape behavior over time. Missiles from Crimea now extend deep into maritime approaches. Drone strikes have targeted port infrastructure not to destroy it outright, but to remind operators that vulnerability is constant. Sea denial capabilities, including naval mines and unmanned surface vessels, have made routing less predictable. Overlaying all of this is continuous surveillance and intelligence gathering, turning the northern Black Sea into a monitored operational environment rather than a neutral space for commerce. The effects of this strategy are subtle but decisive. Shipping insurers are quietly raising premiums, with some even refusing coverage entirely. Operators delay departures or reroute vessels to avoid perceived threats. Port throughput slows not because of physical destruction, but because confidence in Odessa's reliability has been eroded. Grain shipments, in particular, are now more irregular, forcing exporters to seek more expensive and less efficient alternatives. This strategy doesn't require a formal declaration of blockade. It simply creates uncertainty and applies it consistently. Russia doesn't need to stop every ship. It only needs to make each journey a calculated risk. When commerce depends on predictability, even modest disruption can have outsized effects. This is classic sea denial doctrine. The goal isn't total control over the Black Sea, but enough dominance to impose costs on anyone attempting to use it. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor itself reflects this pressure. Routes are becoming longer, narrower, and more exposed as ships attempt to avoid perceived threats. Every additional mile increases vulnerability to surveillance, to potential strikes, and to insurance cancellations. While these changes are marketed as adaptations to a new reality, they are, in fact, evidence of constraint. Importantly, this strategy avoids the political consequences of a direct assault on Odessa. The port remains in Ukrainian hands, and its infrastructure largely stands. But its functionality, the very reason it matters, is steadily eroding. From a strategic standpoint, this is far more efficient than an occupation. A port that exists but cannot operate reliably at scale is effectively neutralized without triggering automatic escalation. Russia's goal isn't to capture Odessa outright. It is to make the port's operations uncertain enough to force international markets to adapt. A port city may continue to exist, but its reliability, its lifeblood, has been seriously compromised. The real question isn't whether Odessa has fallen. It clearly hasn't. The real question is whether Odessa can continue to function as the economic engine it once was under this sustained pressure. If it can't, the implications stretch far beyond Ukraine. This challenge forces us to reconsider not only Odessa's importance, but also the broader balance of power in the region. For Western analysts, this is where the conversation often goes wrong. The focus is typically on territory, who controls what. Maps dominate the discussion. But control over ports, trade routes, and logistics networks doesn't come solely from physical ownership. These systems derive their power from reliability. When reliability disappears, so does economic value, regardless of who technically controls the ground. Russia's restraint in avoiding a full-scale occupation of Odessa is often misread as hesitation or weakness. In reality, it reflects strategic discipline. Occupying Odessa would require massive ground forces, prolonged urban combat, and would almost certainly trigger a major escalation with the West. Instead, Russia has opted for a more efficient path, one that weakens Odessa's ability to function without provoking an all-out confrontation. By applying persistent pressure to maritime access, Russia is transforming Odessa into what could be called a theoretical port. It exists on paper, but its ability to function as a reliable, predictable trading hub is being gradually eroded. From a systems perspective, this approach achieves many of the same objectives as occupation without incurring the political and military costs. This method of sustained pressure is perfectly aligned with the broader strategy of economic warfare. By limiting Ukraine's export capacity, Russia is not only affecting Ukraine, but also transmitting pressure outward into European markets. Grain disruptions drive food prices higher. Delays in fertilizer shipments impact agricultural production months later. Insurance instability causes bottlenecks in shipping, far beyond the Black Sea region itself. These effects may not make headlines, but they are powerful and growing. This form of indirect pressure is particularly effective because it exploits a fundamental Western vulnerability, the dependency on uninterrupted trade flows. Western economies are optimized for efficiency, not for resilience. They assume predictability, but once that predictability vanishes, decision makers face significant challenges that they are not politically prepared to confront. NATO's naval forces are present in the region, but their freedom of action is limited by legal constraints, concerns about escalation, and internal political fragmentation. While they can observe and signal, they face significant difficulties in imposing long-term, decisive control over the sea. This imbalance in control favors Russia, which has shown the ability to maintain pressure without triggering direct military confrontation. It simply needs to keep applying that pressure at a level that NATO is unwilling to counteract decisively. In this way, Russia retains the initiative. This pressure doesn't need to escalate dramatically. It only needs to be sustained at a level that continues to erode confidence in Odessa's reliability. And as long as the West hesitates to take decisive military action, Russia's strategy continues to reap dividends. The deeper implication is that the Black Sea is no longer a peripheral theater. It has become a proving ground for a new form of conflict, one where economic systems are targeted indirectly. The absence of explosions doesn't mean the absence of damage. What we are seeing is economic coercion without direct confrontation, a subtle but effective form of warfare that targets the supply chains, financial instruments, and trade routes that Western economies rely on. And if this model continues to prove successful, the question becomes, how far can this strategy be expanded? The potential for this approach to expand raises critical questions. What happens when economic coercion intersects with broader escalation dynamics? The trajectory from here is no longer linear. The future isn't set in a single direction. Instead, there are multiple possible escalation paths, each shaped by varying degrees of restraint, miscalculation, and structural pressure. None of these paths offer stability. They differ only in how risks are distributed and who absorbs the cost first. The most likely scenario is the normalization of disruption. In this model, nothing dramatic will happen, no decisive strike, no formal blockade. Instead, shipping will adapt under pressure. Insurance premiums will remain elevated. Transit times will increase. Cargo volumes will shrink incrementally. Odessa will continue to function, but as a diminished node, a secondary port rather than the economic engine it once was. This slow, grinding economic attrition is especially dangerous because it doesn't attract immediate political urgency. There are no dramatic images, no viral footage of exploding ports. But over time, the effects are cumulative, eroding Ukraine's export capacity and weakening Europe's supply resilience. This form of pressure may be even more effective than direct military escalation because it operates quietly, often unnoticed by the public. It shifts economic conditions slowly, so by the time it becomes a political issue, the damage is already done. The costs are passed down through the supply chain, higher food prices, reduced availability of goods, and increased public dissatisfaction. This kind of steady pressure can destabilize governments without the need for dramatic military confrontations. It exploits the gap between public perception and the actual vulnerabilities of modern economies. A second scenario could involve the militarization of protection. With the support of Western allies, Ukraine might attempt to bolster port defenses, expanding air defense coverage, introducing convoy-style maritime protection, and fortifying Odessa's defenses could seem like stabilizing solutions. On paper, this would appear to reinforce Odessa's security, but in practice, it introduces new risks. More escort operations would raise the likelihood of close encounters with hostile forces. There's the potential for misidentification and escalation, especially with drones, intelligence surveillance platforms, or air defense systems operating in contested airspace. Any incident involving NATO assets would instantly elevate the conflict from indirect pressure to direct confrontation. This would be a significant escalation, and its consequences could spread far beyond the Black Sea region. The third scenario is one of horizontal escalation. Pressure applied in one area rarely remains confined forever. As access to Odessa becomes more constrained, the focus will shift westward toward the Danube Delta, overland transit corridors, and neighboring ports, such as those in Romania. This would extend the pressure not just on Ukraine's economic survival, but on Europe's broader infrastructure, including energy supplies, river transport, and secondary ports. As a result, the conflict's strategic footprint would widen without altering its basic character. The issue would no longer be framed solely as Ukraine's struggle for survival, but as a challenge to European economic stability. Finally, there is the nuclear dimension. While the direct use of nuclear weapons is unlikely, the presence of nuclear weapons, particularly in the context of Russia, acts as a constant shaping force. The mere possibility of nuclear escalation constrains decision-making, narrows escalation paths, and encourages indirect forms of competition. In such an environment, economic warfare becomes the preferred tool because it operates below the threshold that would justify catastrophic retaliation. This is the reality of modern great power competition. It's no longer just about military conflicts, but about exploiting vulnerabilities in economic systems without triggering full-scale war. Each of these scenarios shares a common characteristic, an absence of resolution. None of them restores the pre-war assumption of free and predictable maritime trade. None removes uncertainty from the system. Instead, each scenario redistributes risk onto insurers, consumers, peripheral states, and ultimately, civilians, who will feel the impact months later through higher prices, shortages, and instability. This is the defining characteristic of modern great power competition. The battlefield is no longer confined to traditional front lines. It extends into logistics systems, financial instruments, and trade routes. The damage accumulates quietly, but it is relentless. The effects of this ongoing pressure may not make headlines in the same way as military clashes, but they shape political stability and human security far more persistently. Behind every disrupted shipment is a chain of consequences that rarely appears on a battlefield map. These effects unfold slowly, often invisibly, but they are just as decisive in shaping the broader outcome of the conflict. As the pressure on Odessa's maritime access continues, its impact doesn't remain confined to Ukraine's coastline. The effects ripple outward, traveling through supply chains, markets, and societies that depend on predictability rather than resilience. For regions that are already operating on the margins, the impact is immediate. Grain exports from the Black Sea are not abstract commodities. They are foundational inputs for food systems across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. When shipments are delayed or rerouted, food prices rise. Governments try to subsidize what they can, but their fiscal capacity is limited. This creates a familiar pattern: higher food costs, increased public dissatisfaction, and political instability that has little to do with ideology and everything to do with affordability. Europe feels the effects differently, but no less significantly. Manufacturing supply chains depend on the timely delivery of raw materials, fertilizers, and energy-related inputs. When shipping becomes unpredictable, inventories begin to thin, production schedules slip, and costs rise. Insurance markets respond to the heightened risk by tightening coverage and raising premiums, compounding the problem. These costs don't vanish, they move downstream, eventually reaching consumers through higher prices and reduced availability. Within Ukraine itself, the human dimension of this disruption is even more direct. Port workers, logistics managers, customs officials, and entire regional economies rely on Odessa's throughput. As port activity slows, local economies shrink. Employment contracts end, municipal revenues drop, and infrastructure repairs, which are already costly under wartime conditions, become a continuous burden rather than an occasional one. Unlike cities near the front lines, these communities suffer without visibility. There are no dramatic images, no viral footage of the impact, only steady, silent economic erosion. This is the quiet side of modern warfare. It doesn't dominate headlines, but it determines endurance. States can absorb battlefield losses if their economies remain functional. They struggle when economic pressure builds incrementally over time without relief. Strategic planners understand this well, which is why trade disruption has become such a powerful tool. It targets societies indirectly, exploiting the gap between public perception and structural vulnerabilities. For Europe, this lesson is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The assumption that maritime commerce exists outside of geopolitical competition has been decisively shattered. Trade routes are no longer neutral corridors, they are strategic terrain. Lifelines that are not defended, diversified, or structurally protected become points of leverage for any actor willing to apply pressure patiently. This realization forces uncomfortable questions. How much economic disruption can European societies tolerate before political consensus fractures? How long can markets absorb uncertainty before risk becomes systemic? And perhaps most importantly, who bears responsibility for securing the arteries on which modern economies depend? These questions aren't just for economists or military planners. They belong to policymakers, voters, and societies that have grown accustomed to stability without recognizing the conditions that sustain it. As these pressures converge, economic, political, and social, we arrive at the final consideration: what this moment reveals about the future of European security, and whether decision makers are prepared to confront the strategic warning now clearly emerging from the Black Sea. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor is not a solution to the crisis. It is a symptom, and symptoms, when ignored, do not resolve themselves. They worsen. What this development signals is a structural shift in the Black Sea.